Welcome back to our TI-83 and TI-84 podcasts. My name is Bob and I'm a tutor at Raritan Valley Community College's Academic Support Center. This is the second module of Session 1 on calculator basics. In the first module we covered the layout of the calculator, the home screen, how to edit calculations, syntax errors and how to fix them, and the order of operations, or PEMDAS. In this module you should be able to do the following once we're done. First off, we're going to look at powers and roots and the multiple ways of doing power and root calculations. Then we're going to look at the calculator mode. We'll look specifically at scientific notation and floating and fixed decimals. Then we'll review once again negative versus subtraction. We'll look at the absolute value function, the rounding function, remainders, and the greatest integer function. Let's get started. We're going to move right to powers and roots. Let's talk about powers and roots. And we're going to see the different ways that we can handle powers and roots on the TI-83 and TI-84 calculators. Let's start with a simple problem. Suppose we wanted to look at 13 squared. Well, what we would do is enter 13, 1, 3, and then you see the x squared key, we would hit that. And that gives us 13 squared. Press enter, and we can see that the answer is 169. Suppose we wanted to take the square root of 121. We would hit second and the square root key, which is right above the x squared. Then we would put in 121, close off the parentheses, and then hit enter, and we can see that the square root of 121 is 11. Now the calculator can also do squares and roots with the up arrow or caret key. So let's go back to that first question of 13 squared. We could enter that as 13 up arrow or to the power of 2 and hit enter, and you can see that we get 169 again. We would enter square root by remembering that the square root is the same thing as raising to the 1/2 power. We would put in 121 raised to the power of, opening parentheses, 1 divided by 2, closing parentheses, and hit enter and get 11. The parentheses are very important, as we reviewed in Module 1, because of PEMDAS. Let's suppose we had put this in without the parentheses. We would have put in 121 raised to the power of 1 divided by 2, and you can see we would have gotten the answer of 60.5, because we would have raised 121 to the first power, which would just be 121, and divided it in half. That would give us our 60.5. So again, parentheses are very important when you're raising powers and roots, especially when you're raising to fractional powers. Why don't we pause for a second to give you a chance to try some calculations on your own. Okay, welcome back. Now let's look at some other root functions. Suppose we wanted to do something other than the squared function. Suppose, for example, we wanted to cube a number. Well, we could put in 2 up arrow 3, or 2 to the 3rd power, and press enter, and we would get 8. But there's another way to do cubes on the TI-83 and TI-84 calculators. We could put in 2 and then go to the math function. And you can see that the third option down there is the cube function. We can scroll down to that and press enter, and now you can see that 2 cubed appears on your screen. Press enter again, and you get 8. And as we said, there's multiple ways to do lots of things on the calculator. Let's do that same calculation. 2, math. Instead of scrolling down to the third function, we could hit the key 3 because it's the third function down there. And you can see it would immediately go to the 2 cube function. Again, press enter, and we would get 8. Suppose we wanted to do a cube root. Well, let's do the cube root of 121 again. In this case, we start with the math function. Go down to that fourth function. I'm just going to hit the number 4 here. And you can see that we get a cube root sign. We put 121 in, close off the parentheses, press enter, and the cube root of 121 is some really funny number, 4.946087443. Suppose we wanted to do the cube root of 64. Again, we would hit the math key. We would go down to the fourth function there, hit the enter for the cube root function, 64, closing parentheses, hit enter, And you can see that the cube root of 64 is 4. Now if we want to do powers that are higher than cubed, we can only use the caret or up arrow key. So if we wanted 2 to the 5th, we would have to enter 2, up arrow, 5, or 2 to the 5th power, and press enter, and that would come out 32. But if we want to do roots that are bigger than cube root, we can do them on this calculator. Suppose we wanted to do the 5th root of 7,776. Well, we could do that one way by putting 7776, raising it to the power of parentheses 1 divided by 5 for the 5th root, closing parentheses, hitting enter, and we would get 6. Another way we could do that is to recognize that 1 divided by 5 is equal to 0.2, and so we could raise 7776 to the 0.2 power, and you can see that we would get the answer 6 again. But another neat way to do it on the calculator is as follows. Since we want the 5th root, put in the number 5, hit the math key, and you can see that the 5th function down there is the xth root of something. In this case, 5th root. We'll scroll down to the xth root, number 5, press enter, and now enter 7776, and press enter, and you can see we can do the 5th root calculation that way. So there are multiple ways of doing powers and roots on the TI-83 and 84. Some of them you can use the math key. Some of them require that you remember that a square root is a 1/2 power, a cube root is a 1/3 power, and so on. And we can also use the square root and the squared key that are directly on the 1 key. Why don't we pause for a second to give you a chance to try some calculations on your own. Okay, welcome back. We're going to talk about the mode function. The mode function sets some of the basic operating rules for your calculator. It controls how numbers are displayed on the home screen, and in certain cases, how input numbers are perceived in the calculator. Let's take a look. Let's press the mode key, and you can see there are a variety of things that come up that we can control with the mode key. First is how numbers are displayed, whether they're in normal mode, scientific mode, or engineering mode. Next, it talks about whether numbers are displayed as floating point numbers or fixed point numbers. And then it talks about whether angles are displayed in radians or degrees, and we'll worry about that a lot more in pre-calculus too. And a bunch of other things that we'll talk about at the appropriate time. But let's concentrate right now on normal versus scientific. We're going to change over to scientific mode. So scroll over to the SCI, and you'll see that it's now highlighted. Press enter so that it becomes the one that's flashing and highlighted, and then second quit to get back to the home screen. Now let's put in a number 456. Press enter, and you can see it's displayed as 4.56E2. Well, what does that mean? Well, in scientific mode, that stands for 4.56 times 10 to the exponent of 2, or 10 squared. And if you take 10 squared, that's 100, and multiply it by 4.56, that comes back to our 456. In scientific mode, the numbers are always displayed with one significant digit before the decimal point, and an exponent that shows what power of 10 the number is multiplied by. Now let's go back and change the mode back to the normal mode for just a second. We're going to go back to the mode key. Normal is already highlighted, so we're going to press enter and hit second quit. Now that we're in normal mode, suppose that we wanted to enter that 4.56 as an exponent number. Okay, and the way we'll do that is we'll enter 4.56, and now we need to get that little e in here. Well, that little e on this screen is shown as a double E on your keyboard right above the comma. So we're going to hit second, double E, and notice just the single E shows up, and then the 2, and if you press enter, you can see we get the number 456 in here. The double E is a little confusing, I know, but it's meant to keep us clear from the letter E, and also clear from the Euler's constant, which is known as e for e to the x, and we'll learn more about that later in Pre-Calc 1. But in scientific notation, if we want to get that e in there, it's the double E over the comma is the key that counts. Now let's look at floating versus fixed point. Suppose that we wanted to cut our numbers off after 3 decimal places. Let's do 1 divided by 3. 1 divided by 3. And you can see in floating point mode, we get about 8 or 9 3s after the decimal point. Let's change to fixed point mode and see how that plays out. Hit the mode key. We scroll down to floating point, and we're going to move over to the number 3 for 3 fixed decimal places, and press enter, and now you can see the 3 is highlighted. Second, quit, and now let's re-enter that calculation. And just as a bit of review, do you remember that we could re-enter a calculation by pressing second and enter for the entry key and then bring that calculation back? Now if we hit enter again, notice this time it comes up as 0.333. It's been fixed to 3 decimal places. Let's try another calculation. Let's do 2 divided by 3. If we press enter, you can see we get 0.667. Notice the last decimal place has been rounded to a 7. Now, in most of our math classes, we're going to be dealing in the normal mode and in floating point. So let's go back to the mode key and make sure that we're in floating point. We'll go down to float and press enter, and we'll move on from here. Hit second quit, and now let's move on to another topic. We're going to move on to absolute value, but first a little review of negative numbers versus opposite of is probably appropriate. As we said in the first module, the way you enter in a negative number is by putting in the opposite of sign, which is down right next to the decimal point. It's the minus sign in parentheses, followed by the number. So if we wanted to put in -9, we'd press the opposite of 9 and press enter, and you get a -9. If we wanted to take 5 minus a -5, we would put in 5, use the subtraction sign, which is the gray key, followed by the opposite of sign, and then the 5 key, so 5 minus a -5. And look at the minus signs, they actually look a little different there. And press enter, and you can see 5 minus a -5 is 10. Suppose we did it this way. Suppose we did 5 minus -5. If we pressed enter, we get a syntax error. And we would scroll down to go to, or hit the number 2, and you could see that the calculator does not like that second minus sign. We need to change that to an opposite of sign. Press enter, and we get the correct answer again. So again, it's very important that we know when we're using minus and when we're using the opposite of. Suppose we just, at this point, wanted to put in -9 and we made a mistake and put in the minus sign rather than the opposite of sign. If we enter -9, you can see it's actually going to bring the answer down from the previous line and subtract 9 from it, and we get the answer 1. We would not get the -9 that we wanted. All that's important because now we're going to move on to the absolute value function. If we want to do an absolute value calculation, the way we do that is by pressing the math key. And now you see across the top that there are a whole bunch of options. It says math and num and complex and prob. Well, in the first part of this module, we were using the cubes and cube roots and x roots. But the option we can do is to scroll across the top to the num function. And now you can see some other functions that pop up on the screen. The abs function stands for absolute value. So we'll press enter, and if we take the absolute value of the opposite of 9 with a closing parentheses, you can see we get a +9, just as we expect. So absolute value is done with the abs key, which is on the math key. Let's take a look again. We're going to do the opposite of, or the absolute value of -11. Hit math, scroll to the right, find the absolute value, put in -11, and again we use the opposite of key, ending parentheses there, and then hit enter. Let's see what would happen if we put in the absolute value of -11. I think we're going to get an error. Hit the math key, scroll over to number, press enter for absolute value, put in minus 11, close the parentheses, press enter, and you can see we get our friend the syntax error once again. Scroll down to go to, press enter, change that minus sign to an opposite of sign, and we get the correct answer. Why don't we pause for a second to give you a chance to try some calculations on your own. Now we're going to talk about some of the other math functions that are available in the TI-83 and TI-84. Let's start by doing a simple calculation on the home screen. Let's do 8 divided by 3. And press enter, and you can see that we get 2.66666667. Well, there are several different math functions that we can use to talk about different parts of that number. Suppose, for example, we wanted to get the fixed part, or the integer part of that number. We can go to the math key, press math, scroll across to the number functions, and then if you go down to number 3, you can see that that's I part, or the integer part. Hit enter, and now we're looking for the I part of a number, and we could put in the I part of the previous answer. Let's do second answer, which is on the opposite of key, closing parentheses, and press answer, and you can see the integer part of that number is 2. Suppose we wanted to get the remainder, or the floating part of that number. Again, we would go to the math key, we would scroll across the number. This time I'm going to hit the number 4 for the floating part, F part, and I'm going to put in the calculation here, 8 divided by 3, closing parentheses, and you can see that we get 0.66666667. So we just got the floating part. So if you need to get the remainder, it's possible to get the remainder. Let's take a look at one other trick that the calculator has for us. Suppose I wanted to convert 0.666667 back to a fraction. I would hit the math key, and right there on the math function you can see that fraction. Press enter, and it says convert the answer to a fraction. Press enter again, and you can see that 0.666667 is 2/3. So we can convert decimals to fractions by doing the division, or by using the fraction key, or fractions to decimal by just strictly doing the division. Let's try one more. Suppose we wanted to round off that 8 divided by 3 calculation to 3 significant digits. There's also a function for that. It's called the round function. Let's go to math, scroll across the number again, and now you can see the second function is the round function. We're going to hit enter, and we're going to put in our calculation, 8 divided by 3, and now we need to tell it how many decimal places. So we put in a comma, and then we put in 2, closing parentheses, and hit the enter key, and you can see that now we've got 2.67, or 8/3 rounded to do decimal places. There are lots of other functions on the calculator as well. These are some of the ones, the basic ones that were used early in Pre-Calc 1. We'll talk about the others in later modules as we go on. Why don't we pause for a second to give you a chance to try some calculations on your own. Before we go, we're going to take a look at one other function, the greatest integer function. The greatest integer function is used in Chapter 1 of the Pre-Calc book, and we're going to take a look at it here on the calculator. If we put in the greatest integer function, what we get is the largest integer, which is less than or equal to the number that we put in. So let's try a couple. We're going to hit the math key, scroll over to number, and go down to number 5, and that's the greatest integer function. Press enter, and let's do the greatest integer function of a positive number. Let's try 5.3, closing parentheses, and the greatest integer function is 5. Let's try it now with a negative number. Again, we're going to hit math, we're going to go scroll over to number, we're going to go down to the integer function for greatest integer, press enter, and let's put in the opposite of 5.3. In this case, we get -6, because the largest integer that is less than or equal to -5.3 is -6. Let's contrast that to what we would have got if we had looked for the integer part of that number. Hit math, scroll across the number, Go down to number 3 for I part, press enter, enter the opposite of 5.3, closing parentheses, press enter, and you get a negative 5. So the integer function, int, stands for greatest integer, whereas I part says throw away the decimal and just keep what is the integer part of the number. The two answers are the same when we deal with positive numbers, but in negative numbers, the difference is always 1. So let's summarize what we've learned in this module. This is Session 1 Calculator Basics, and this module is Basic Mathematics Operations. We looked at powers and roots and the multiple ways we can do powers and root calculations, including the squared key, the square root key, and the various math functions that are available. We also looked at using the up arrow or caret as a way to do exponentiation. We looked at the calculator mode, and specifically we looked at scientific notation versus normal notation, and floating versus fixed decimals. We looked and reviewed once again about negatives versus subtraction. We looked at the absolute value function, the rounding function, remainders, and the greatest integer function. So this concludes this module. We hope we'll see you next in Module 3. Current students at Raritan Valley Community College can get additional support by coming to the Academic Support Center. The Academic Support Center is open during most school hours, and you can check the hours by going to the web, www.raritanval.edu, and looking under the tab Current Students, and under Academic Resources, look for the Academic Support Center. The Academic Support Center offers a wide variety of tutoring assistance from math and English to the sciences and various humanity courses. The Academic Support Center is there to help you.